Tehran, winter 1979. Rooftops answer rooftops with a single cry, Allahu Akbar, as millions flood the streets and a monarchy totters. The man returning after 14 years in exile is not a general or a politician, but a cleric, Ruhollah Khomeini. He steps onto the tarmac at Mehrabad on the 1st of February 1979, rides to the cemetery of Behesht-i-Zahra, and declares the Shah's last cabinet illegal, vowing, "I will appoint the government. I will strike this government on the mouth." Only months before, the same city glittered under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the self-styled Shahanshah, King of Kings. Oil money fed jets and tanks, American advisors filled ministries, and Iran was a Cold War pillar. But soft power sat on hard resentment. When the crowds moved to the west, Saddam Hussein watched the vacuum open. Within 18 months, his tanks would cross the border and ignite one of the longest conventional wars of the 20th century, beginning 22 September 1980 and ending only with UN Security Council Resolution 598 and a ceasefire in 1988. A conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and normalized chemical weapons on a modern battlefield. The revolution and the war that followed did more than topple a ruler or freeze a front line. They rewired the Middle East, shifting alliances, militarizing the Gulf, and anchoring a new rivalry of ideology and power that still shapes the region today. To understand how the Middle East was rewired, we begin in the glittering twilight of the 1970s, an age when oil money, Cold War politics, and ambition fused into something combustible. In Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi presided over what appeared to be a modernizing empire. Skyscrapers rose above Tehran's bazaars, oil pipelines snaked toward the Persian Gulf, and Western advisors filled ministries. The Shah envisioned a great civilization, an empire modern in science and technology, yet proud of its ancient heritage. Behind the glamour, though, lay a regime whose crown rested on foreign steel. The United States, eager to maintain a bulwark against Soviet influence, flooded Iran with weapons and cash. By the mid-1970s, Iran's armed forces ranked among the region's most formidable, equipped with advanced fighter jets, tanks, and gunships. And yet that power masked fragility. Beneath the surface of prosperity, resentment fermented. The Shah's so-called White Revolution, launched in 1963, sought to modernize Iran through land reform, literacy campaigns, enfranchisement of women, and industrial expansion. It redistributed land to some 2.5 million families, built rural schools and clinics, and radically altered social and legal norms. But its benefits were unevenly distributed. Many of the traditional bases of society, the clergy, merchants, landed elites, felt their power eroding. In the bazaars and in the villages, the change felt sudden. The clergy, once pillars of local society, saw their influence diminished. The secret police, Savak, silenced dissent with torture and fear. The gap between palace and street grew to an abyss. The modernization drive may have fueled the economy, but it also sharpened the fault lines of society. Across the border in Iraq, another man was shaping his destiny. Saddam Hussein, as deputy to President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and de facto power behind the Ba'ath Party, envisioned Iraq as the center of a new Arab world, secular, socialist, and strong. He built a state on paranoia and nationalism, building monuments to himself even while the prisons overflowed. Iraq's oil wealth, though smaller than Iran's, was growing fast. In 1972, Iraq nationalized its oil industry, and the boom of the 1970s funded an ambitious expansion of the military-industrial complex. And yet beneath that strength lay a deep vulnerability. A Shia majority governed by a Sunni elite, restive and repressed, a Kurdish question in the north, and a border dispute with Iran over the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Between these two rising powers stretched the narrow waterway of the Shatt al-Arab, the channel where the Tigris and Euphrates met the Persian Gulf, a strategic lifeline for oil and trade, and a point of ancient rivalry. In 1975, Iraq and Iran signed the Algiers Agreement, mediated by Algeria, which granted Iran navigation rights in exchange for halting its support to Kurdish rebels in Iraq. To Saddam, the treaty was humiliation. To Tehran, It was merely the latest chapter in a long struggle for dominance. By the close of the decade, the balance seemed clear. Iran, the Shah's empire, was Washington's sword arm in the region. Iraq, though ambitious, played a secondary role, navigating between superpowers. But history, like the desert wind, shifts suddenly. By 1978, oil prices had enriched the royal court, while inflation crushed the streets. Strikes crippled refineries. Demonstrations swelled from a few thousand to millions. The Shah's police fired into crowds. Funerals became protests. Protests became funerals. A rhythm of death and defiance that spread across the nation. Then Khomeini's voice, through tapes and exiles, thundered, "We shall cut off the hands of foreign powers." The monarchy finally collapsed in February 1979. The United States lost its most reliable Gulf ally. Secular nationalism across the Arab world confronted a rising ideological rival, political Islam. The revolution's victory marked the end of one empire and the beginning of a new kind of war, one fought as much for souls as for land. The overthrow of the Shah in February 1979 was not a culmination. It was the opening chapter of something far larger. The new regime that took power in Tehran was a complex fusion, part clerical theocracy, part populist movement, part military mobilized state. In the months that followed the revolution, the once mighty imperial Iranian army, trained by the United States and equipped with one of the region's most advanced arsenals, was purged, disorganized, and rendered deeply mistrusted by the regime. Ruhollah Khomeini and his inner circle viewed the old army as the engine of a tyrant. In its place, they created the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC in short. They expanded the Basij militia, volunteer forces drawn from mosques and the streets, whose loyalty was not to the state, but to the revolution and the clerical order. Meanwhile, Iran itself was in turbulence. Universities were shut as a cultural revolution cleansed campuses of secularists. Ethnic unrest erupted in Kurdistan and Baluchistan, and the economy stalled under strikes and mass discontent. Then, in November 1979, students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. An act that turned Iran into an international pariah. That isolation had consequences. American and Western weapons shipments to Iran halted. Spare parts and logistics for aircraft, tanks, and radar systems vanished. The Iranian armed forces, once considered among the world's most capable, found themselves operationally hollow. Across the border in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein read these developments with predatory clarity. Iraq had long seen Iran as its rival for dominance in the Gulf. The two states had clashed for decades over the strategically vital waterway of the Shatt al-Arab, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow into the Persian Gulf. In 1975, largely under Iranian pressure and Algerian mediation, Iraq signed the Algiers Agreement, conceding Iran certain navigation rights, in Baghdad's eyes, a humiliating treaty. Now, with Iran ideologically transformed and distracted, Saddam sensed his moment. He declared the Algiers Agreement null, accused Iran of inciting Iraq's suppressed Shia majority, and styled himself as defender of the Arab nation against what he called Khomeini's Persian menace. On 22 September 1980, without formal proclamation, the Iraqi Air Force struck Iranian airfields across Tehran, Tabriz, Dezful, and Isfahan. Shortly thereafter, ground forces advanced across a 600-kilometer front into Khuzestan, Iran's oil-rich southwest. The plan was swift: seize the twin cities of Khorramshahr and Abadan, and force Iran to the negotiating table before the revolution consolidated. Columns of T-62 tanks rolled through date palm plantations and flooded marshes. Iraqi planners assumed the Arab-majority province of Khuzestan might welcome them as liberators, a calculation that proved disastrously wrong. The invasion caught Iran off guard, but not helpless. Mohammad Reza Shah's army may have been diminished, but the revolution's mobilized masses surged to the front. Clerics from Tehran broadcast sermons, volunteers from mosques joined in, and the new regime declared the conflict a sacred defense of the homeland. What began as a short blitzkrieg soon became a grim prelude to 8 years of attrition. In the fall of 1980, the war's character was fixed. Ideology and nationalism bound Iran's defenders. Mechanized invasion and Arab pride propelled Iraq's assault. The gates of a bloody stalemate had swung open, neither side prepared for what lay ahead. Saddam Hussein's war plan assumed Iran would crack in days. On September 22nd to 23rd, 1980, Iraqi jets struck Iranian air bases. The next morning, Iran's Air Force answered with Operation Kaman 99, launching roughly 140 fighter bombers deep into Iraq to hit H3, Al-Rashid, Kirkuk, and other targets. An Iranian Tab 6 officer remembered the briefing that dawn. "We have been trained for this moment." The result was not the air supremacy Baghdad expected, but a contested sky that blunted Iraq's opening gambit and bought Iran time to mobilize. On land, Iraqi armored columns pushed on three axes: north toward Qasr-e-Shirin, center toward Dezful, and south into Khuzestan toward Abadan and Khorramshahr. The flat, canal-cut terrain that seemed perfect for mechanized advance proved treacherous. Date groves channeled movement, irrigation ditches trapped tanks, and flooding turned fields to mire. By late October 1980, Iraqi forces encircled Khorramshahr. After 35 days of house-to-house combat, the city fell on 10th November 1980. A victory bought at staggering cost, and one that fixed the front rather than breaking it open. Elsewhere, the invasion stalled. Iraq ringed Abadan but could not crush it. In September 1981, Iran's first coordinated counteroffensive, Operation Samen Ola Eme, burst the siege, reopened the Avaz-Abadan road, and captured thousands of Iraqi prisoners. In Tehran, the victory was framed as obedience to Khomeini's direct order to break the siege, a morale pivot from survival to counterpunch. Momentum shifted through the winter. In late November, early December 1981, Iran struck again with Operation Tariq al-Quds, or Path to Jerusalem in English, a joint Army IRGC attack that retook Bostan and 800 square kilometers around Suzangard, severing Iraqi supply lines along the Hawiza Marsh rim. The operation previewed Iran's evolving method: regular army armor for the breach, Revolutionary Guard brigades to flood the gap and hold, a hybrid that compensated for Iran's officer purges with mass and elan. The decisive turn came in March 1982 with Operation Fath al-Mobin, Victory Manifest. Over 22 to 28 March, Iranian forces under Ali Sayyad Shirazi encircled Iraqi units east of Dezful and Shush, destroying or capturing large quantities of armor and pushing Baghdad's line back toward the border. Iraqi command now confronted a new reality. The invader had become the encircled. Iran pressed the advantage with Operation Bait ul-Muqaddas, 24th April to 22nd May 1982, a four-phase offensive across the Karkeh and toward the Shat al-Arab. After brutal fighting around Polinau and Shalamche, Iranian troops re-entered Khorramshahr on 24th May 1982, taking thousands of prisoners. State media called it simply the liberation. For Iran's leadership, it was proof that the revolution could not only endure, but defeat a foreign army in the field. At that moment, the war could have ended. Iraq signaled willingness to accept a ceasefire on the original frontier. Many in Iran's regular army favored stopping on the border. The invader had been repelled, strategic depth restored. But Ayatollah Khomeini had framed the struggle in scriptural terms. In sermons and messages during 1982, he invoked the command, Jang Jang ta Piruzi, war, war, until victory. In practice, this meant rejecting a ceasefire that left Saddam in power and keeping the front moving toward Basra. Iran's strategic choice, from defensive liberation to punitive invasion, flowed from that line. By summer 1982, the front stabilized roughly on the border, with Iran now massing to cross into Iraq. Saddam's generals dug belts of trenches, wire, and mines, flooded canals on command, and prepared kill zones on the approaches to Basra. In Tehran, the debate was over, at least publicly. The sacred defense had become an offensive to break Ba'athist Iraq. The opening phase had ended. Baghdad's gamble to dismember Iran had failed, and a revolution that many assumed would implode had instead learned to fight. The next phase would not be blitzkrieg, but attrition, a desert echo of the Great War, measured in meters, mines, and shells. By 1983, the Iran-Iraq War had hardened into the Middle East's own version of Verdun, two exhausted armies staring at one another across an unmoving front. The early lightning war had dissolved into attrition. The Iranian press called it Defa-e Muqaddas, the sacred defense. Baghdad's papers replied with images of Saddam in field dress, promising, "We will smash the Persian aggression." Both sides were lying to their people in the same way, that victory was near. Iran's army and the Revolutionary Guards now fought side by side, but not always together. Command rivalries were constant. The Guards wanted ideological offensives, mass, human wave attacks by Basij volunteers. The army favored cautious maneuver. Historian Pierre Razou notes that between 1983 and 1986, Iran launched no fewer than a dozen large-scale operations, none decisive, all costly. Those offensives bore Quranic names: Valfajr, Khaybar, Badr, Karbala. Each was announced as the blow that would open the road to Karbala and Jerusalem by the Ayatollah Khomeini in his radio speeches back in 1983. Each ended the same way: minefields, gas, and machine gun fire cutting down thousands. Survivors described running through mustard fumes, shouting, "Ya Hussein," as comrades fell beside them. Iraq, reeling after 1982, rebuilt faster than anyone expected. Gulf monarchies funneled billions in loans. The Soviet Union reopened its arsenals. France delivered Mirage F-1s and Exocet missiles, and Washington quietly supplied satellite intelligence. In exchange, Baghdad guaranteed to hold the line against Khomeini's revolution. With these resources, Saddam's army turned defensive warfare into an industrial system. British historian John Keegan compared it to the Western Front, a lattice of fire and earthwork stretching from the northern mountains to the Gulf. Behind the berms lurked a new terror: chemical weapons. UN mission reports from 1984 to 86 confirmed Iraq's systematic use of mustard and taboon gas at Majnoon and Hoveyz. In early 1984, Iran's Operation Khaybar hurled 250,000 men into the marshes north of Basra. They seized the Majnoon Islands, small, oil-rich, and almost useless tactically, at the price of 20,000 dead. Saddam's response was unambiguous: gas, airstrikes, and floods. The wetlands became a no-man's land of chemical residue and wrecked armor. As land war stagnated, both governments sought leverage elsewhere. In 1984, Iraq began targeting Iranian shipping. Iran retaliated against tankers serving Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The press dubbed it the Tanker War. By 1986, more than 400 vessels had been hit or mined. Supertankers burned on the horizon. Global insurers doubled rates. Western navies deployed to the Gulf. On the home fronts, fatigue set in. By 1985, Iran's casualties exceeded 500,000. Economist Ervand Abrahamian estimated that nearly every family lost someone at the front. Ration cards became symbols of patriotism. In Baghdad, conscription reached boys barely 16. Both regimes ruled by fear. Dissent equated to treason. Then came a shock reversal. In February 1986, Iran launched Operation Valfajr 8, crossing the Shatt al-Arab under cover of fog and seizing the Faw Peninsula, Iraq's only outlet to the Gulf. For the first time, Iranian troops fought on Iraqi soil and held it. Journalist Robert Fisk reported from Tehran that the mosques erupted in victory prayers. Khomeini smiled for the first time in years. The capture of Faw electrified Iran and terrified Baghdad. Saddam replaced his defense minister, executed senior officers, and ordered new gas stocks from European suppliers. The Gulf states tripled their loans. U.S. satellites began providing near real-time imagery of Iranian troop concentrations. Yet by year's end, the front froze again. Neither side could sustain an advance. Both were trapped by the scale of their own rhetoric. Iran called its endurance divine. Iraq called its defense heroic. Behind the slogans lay ruin, cities in blackout, economies collapsing, an entire generation growing up under sirens. The war had reached equilibrium through exhaustion. It would take 2 more years and unimaginable brutality to break it. By early 1986, both nations were at the end of endurance. Yet in war, exhaustion can be as decisive as genius. The capture of the Faw Peninsula had been Iran's high watermark, an amphibious victory so unexpected that even U.S. analysts described it as the most successful Iranian operation of the war. For Ayatollah Khomeini, In his 1986 sermon, "Fall was divine proof." Faith in God turns back the tide of disbelief, no matter how strong its weapons. Baghdad, however, drew the opposite conclusion. Saddam Hussein, humiliated, told his generals, "If we lose Fa, we lose Iraq." In a 2003 Al Jazeera 2003 interview, he purged commanders, centralized control, and poured the state's remaining wealth into new fortifications, Scud missiles, and poison gas. The Iraqi regime began using chemical munitions as routine battlefield doctrine. UN investigative teams recorded repeated large-scale attacks employing mustard and nerve agents between 1986 and 1988. Iran, intoxicated by Fa, pressed on. Between 1986 and 1987, it launched the Karbala series of offensives, Karbala 4, Karbala 5, Nasser 8, all aimed at breaching Iraqi defenses before Basra. Each began with Quranic invocations, each ended in catastrophe. Karbala 5, January 1987, was the bloodiest. More than 40,000 Iranians and 20,000 Iraqis died in 10 days of artillery fire and gas. One Revolutionary Guard veteran recalled, "The sky turned yellow, and the smell of garlic came before the pain. Then people fell like wheat." The Basra front held, but the war's horror spread to the capitals. In 1987, both sides began striking cities directly with Scud missiles. The War of the Cities saw Tehran and Baghdad pounded night after night. Civilians slept in basements, listening for the thud of impact. At sea, the tanker war escalated into a confrontation with the United States. Kuwait, fearing bankruptcy, asked for American protection of its tankers. Washington answered with Operation Earnest Will, U.S. naval escorts for reflagged ships. On 17 May 1987, an Iraqi Mirage F-1 mistakenly fired 2 Exocet missiles into the U.S. frigate USS Stark, killing 37 sailors. Baghdad called it an error. Washington accepted the apology, evidence of how far Western policy leaned toward Iraq. A year later, tragedy struck the other side. On the 3rd of July 1988, amid escalating Gulf skirmishes, the cruiser USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, mistaking the Airbus for an attacking jet. All 290 civilians aboard were killed. The U.S. Navy called it a tragic accident. Tehran called it murder. In the Iranian street, it confirmed the belief that the whole world was united against Islam. Meanwhile, Saddam's rebuilt army, 55 divisions strong, rearmed by the Soviet Union and funded by Gulf money, was preparing its counterstroke. In February 1988, during Operation Ramadan Mubarak, Iraqi forces retook the Fa Peninsula in just 36 hours, combining artillery barrages, gas shells, and helicopter assaults guided by U.S. satellite imagery. Tehran was stunned. Within months, Iraqi offensives recaptured the Majnoon Islands, Mehran, and Hawiza, every piece of lost ground. For the first time, Iranian commanders publicly admitted that offensive operations are no longer possible. Then came the crime that would define the war's end. On the 16th of March 1988, Iraqi aircraft bombed the Kurdish town of Halabja with a cocktail of mustard, sarin, and tabun gas. Around 5,000 civilians died within hours, the largest chemical massacre since 1918. The scene defied imagination, wrote journalist Rafe Fiennes for The Times. Entire families lay as they had been eating lunch. International outrage was brief. The Reagan administration condemned the attack but blocked any UN resolution naming Iraq as culprit. By mid-1988, Iran's economy was collapsing, its youth exhausted. Khomeini, informed that new offensives were impossible, issued a secret order to accept UN Resolution 598. On the 20th of July 1988, he announced the ceasefire, setting himself up as a martyr to his followers. "I drink this chalice of poison for the sake of Islam." The guns fell silent on the 20th of August, 1988. No treaty followed, only an armistice. Each side had lost roughly 500,000 soldiers and civilians, billions of dollars, and a generation's hope. Political scientist Charles Tripp called it a piece of exhaustion, the point at which both regimes realized they could lose everything by winning a little more. The longest conventional war of the 20th century was over. Its cost defied imagination. but its consequences were just beginning. When the ceasefire took effect on the 20th of August 1988, no side could claim victory. There were no parades, no peace conferences, only silence. A United Nations observer in Khuzestan wrote, "The battlefield is quiet but smells of gas and decay. It is a piece of exhaustion, not reconciliation." For Iran, the 8-year ordeal left more than 300,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Oil production had halved. Yet the regime's survival became its ultimate vindication. Ayatollah Khomeini told his commanders in one of his last letters, "We did not fight for territory, but to preserve Islam's independence." That belief transfigured defeat into endurance. The war entered Iran's national memory as the sacred defense, Difa'i Muqaddas, a narrative sanctifying sacrifice over outcome. Khomeini would not see the long peace. He died on the 3rd of June 1989. His funeral drew millions. Historian Ervand Abrahamian observed that the old man's coffin swayed atop the crowd like the revolution itself, battered, defiant, but unbroken. His successor, Ali Khamenei, and new President Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani turned inward, rebuilding and rearming. The war's lesson was clear: never again depend on foreign powers for security. Iran poured resources into missile development, self-sufficiency in arms, and a doctrine of asymmetric warfare built around the IRGC and its new Quds force. Across the border, Saddam Hussein emerged proclaiming victory, but presiding over ruin. Iraq owed more than $60 billion to Gulf monarchies that had bankrolled his campaign. Oil revenues collapsed. Food was rationed for the first time in decades. To his generals he boasted, "We defended the Arab nations single-handed," but the mask was cracking. Journalist Patrick Coburn later wrote, "Saddam won the war and lost the peace. He kept his throne only by turning the army's guns inward." Iraq's next move made that warning prophetic. In August 1990, claiming that Kuwait had stolen Iraqi oil and conspired with imperialism, Saddam's tanks rolled across the border. The invasion provoked the US-led Gulf War, 1991, which obliterated much of Iraq's military in weeks. When uprisings flared among Iraq's Shia and Kurds, Saddam crushed them with helicopter gunships and the same chemical stockpiles first tested on Iranians. The consequences rippled outward. The Persian Gulf became a militarized corridor. US warships and bases, first deployed during the tanker war, never left. Sectarian lines deepened. The Shia revival that Khomeini had kindled now resonated from Lebanon's Hezbollah to the marshes of southern Iraq, while Sunni monarchies saw encirclement. Political scientist Vali Nasser later called it the re-Shiification of regional politics. Internationally, Western governments faced their own moral accounting. Declassified US and British archives confirmed extensive wartime intelligence and material aid to Iraq, even as chemical attacks mounted. French defense sales, Soviet arms deliveries, and Gulf funding had all prolonged the slaughter. The New York Times editorial of 23 August 1988 admitted, "For 8 years the world watched in silence, preferring the balance of power to the balance of justice." Among the survivors, the silence was more intimate. In Iran, mothers tended cemeteries called Gardens of the Martyrs. In Iraq, mass graves in the south swallowed unidentified soldiers. An Iranian veteran told the Tehran Times in 1990, "We won by surviving, but it is a victory that leaves you alone." When historians later named it the Forgotten War, they meant not insignificance, but trauma. The world looked away because the images were unbearable. Children in gas masks, oil fires, human forms turned to dust. Yet the war never truly ended. Its echoes resounded through every later conflict. The 1991 Gulf War, the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, the proxy wars in Syria and Yemen. Each was fought in a landscape first scarred between 1980 and 1988. One UN diplomat would summarize it best during a Security Council in 1989. The ceasefire stopped the killing, but it did not stop the war. It merely scattered it. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1988, the Middle East did not return to equilibrium. It settled into a new architecture of power the war had forged. The frontiers scarcely moved, yet the logic behind them changed. Two models emerged from the wreckage and still contend today: a fortress state in Iraq and a resistant state in Iran. mirror images built on trauma, debt, and doctrine. Iraq's fortress was erected around one man. Saddam Hussein claimed victory while standing atop a hollowed economy and a militarized society. Gulf loans that had sustained the war, more than $60 billion, hardened into shackles. In the language of Baghdad radio, he insisted Iraq had defended the Arab nation. Debt and pride pushed him toward a new gamble: the invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, a move that triggered the US-led Gulf War and set Iraq on the path to isolation sanctions and eventual state collapse. Iran's model moved in the opposite direction. Having fought largely alone and under sanctions, Tehran absorbed a hard lesson: never again entrust survival to outsiders. From 1988 onward, the Islamic Republic invested in ballistic missiles, self-sufficient arms production, and asymmetric reach through the IRGC and what later became the Quds Force, a doctrine of forward defense designed to push threats outward via partners and proxies. The ceasefire itself, UN Security Council Resolution 598, became part of Iran's political memory. When he accepted it, Ruhollah Khomeini told the nation that doing so was like drinking from a poisoned chalice, a phrase later repeated by Iranian leaders to frame compromise as sacrifice for survival. The war also militarized the Persian Gulf permanently. The tanker war drew Western navies in. Operation Earnest Will of 1987–88 put U.S. warships on convoy duty for Kuwaiti tankers and created a presence that never truly left. Within that escalation, two incidents defined the era's perilous fog: the Iraqi attack on USS Stark on 17 May 1987, which killed 37 U.S. sailors, and the U.S. shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 on the 3rd of July 1988, which killed 290 civilians. Both became touchstones of grievance and proof in Tehran's narrative that the world favored Iraq, or at least preferred Iran isolated. Chemical weapons, the war's unforgivable normalization, left a second legacy: impunity. UN missions confirmed repeated, large-scale Iraqi use of mustard and nerve agents in 1984–88. The world censured in the abstract, but rarely named Baghdad in the text. That silence taught both regimes that geopolitics could outrank morality, a lesson that outlived the ceasefire. The war also rewired identity politics. Khomeini's revolution had already elevated a transnational Shia voice, but the crucible of 1980–88 transformed it into a geopolitical force echoed from Lebanon to Iraq. As Vali Nasser argued, the conflict catalyzed a regional Shia revival that unsettled Sunni monarchies and reshaped alignments from the Gulf to the Levant. From a distance, historians often likened the Iran-Iraq War to the First World War in miniature. Trench belts, mining, gas, human wave assaults, and peace without victory. But for Iranians and Iraqis, it felt less like a replica and more like an origin story. In Iran, the conflict hardened into the sacred defense, a narrative of endurance that sanctified sacrifice over outcome. In Iraq, it became an alibi for an ever harsher police state, then the prelude to the disasters of 1990–1991 and beyond. Even the way the world watched left marks. Western governments that condemned chemical warfare nonetheless tilted strategically toward Baghdad, through credits, intelligence, or silence, in the name of containing revolutionary Iran. That realpolitik seeded a durable Iranian suspicion of outside powers, and helps explain why, decades later, missile parades in Tehran are as much memorials as they are messages. Verdict: in territory, the war ended where it began. In power, it remade the map. Iran emerged isolated but ideologically armed and strategically adapted. Iraq, militarized but fatally indebted, and primed for the Kuwaiti misadventure that would shatter it. The conflict did not decide who would dominate the Middle East. It decided how the struggle for dominance would be waged, through proxies, missiles, sanctions, and narratives of survival rather than annexation. 40 years on, you can still trace the war's wiring behind today's crises. In Syrian and Yemeni battlefields, in Gulf arms races and sanctions regimes, in the sectarian scars of Baghdad and the strategic caution of Tehran. To borrow a line often invoked in Iranian cultural memory, only the voice remains. The slogans, the funerals, the speeches that taught nations to endure. 8 years of war, more than 1 million killed or wounded, No territorial change, no clear winner. When the guns fell silent in 1988, the battlefield did not disappear. It shifted. One side turned outward, building influence beyond its borders. Iraq drew the lesson that strength mattered more than consent. The other turned inward, ruling through force and fortification. Iran drew the lesson that depth mattered more than borders. Both interpretations reshaped the Middle East long after the ceasefire. Neither produced stability.